great day. Uh, Only have time for kind of a quick stream today. As you notice, I even forgot to start streaming early like I normally do, just because kind of busy. So, because I have a lot of stuff to take care of, we're just gonna chill for a bit, hang out, uh, and probably end a little bit earlier. But that's okay. Everyone's got stuff to do. I didn't even have time to make tea. I just had my water. That said, water is great. Stay hydrated. It has been quite warm where I am at the very least, so it's important for me to drink up. Give me a moment. Don't forget to stay hydrated out there. So I figured what we do today is talk a little bit about these are the questions. And the reason why this is happening is because of a confluence of errors. So on Thursday, we had Hexic on again for another instance of these are the questions. I love these segments, and Hexic is a great guy to have these conversations with. Unfortunately, there was kind of an issue. Basically, my OBS, the streaming software, uh, disconnected from my headset at some point. It didn't really alert me to that. There are like some indicators I can find, but it's not the kind of thing that I look for very often. And so none of my audio was picked up. So I have the video of just Hexic's end, which don't get me wrong, is extremely interesting. It's just hard to it's hard to like pay attention to a conversation when half of it's missing. I might talk for 30, 45 seconds and it's just nothing, and you don't necessarily know what Hexic is responding back to, and so sadly that's just kind of gone, and it's particularly disappointing because that was, to our minds, the best. These are the questions so far. I know we've only done a few of them, but it was a really, really great conversation, and we were both pretty stoked about how it went. And when I found out that there was just no audio from my side, yeah, it really sucked. And there's just not anything I can do about it, right? I have the video file, but it's not that the volumes are just low. It's just my headset was not connected at all to OBS, and so there's just no audio from me. So because of that, and because of how cool that conversation was, I do want to go back over it a bit. Like we can't really recreate it, right? Part of the cool thing about these are the questions is that we're trying to think these through live. Well, we've already had a 2-hour conversation about this. We've already thought about a lot of the stuff. A lot of the mistakes, or maybe not mistakes, but like a lot of things that we came to disagree with, well, they're not going to come up again because we've come to disagree with them. So instead, why don't we just chat a bit about what happened, and hopefully it'll seem as interesting to you as it did to us. I've actually had this conversation, brought this up to some of my personal friends, and they found it a very interesting conversation. So if you want to chat about it, I mean, I would highly encourage anyone for any instance of these are the questions to chat. Like, let me know what you think. Participate in the conversation. Practice. Do some philosophy yourself. Everyone is capable of doing it. And not only can it be fun, but it's mental exercise. So if you want to do that, chat, comments, wherever, please. I would love nothing more. Oh, my Discord is another great place to do that. Also a good place to suggest ideas for these are the questions. A friend of mine did that. I told him to do it through my Discord, but he just DM'd me. Yeah, it's fine. But yeah, if you have ideas you think that would make for good questions, well, there are lots of places for you to do that. So that all being said, what did we talk about? The question that we were discussing was kind of a multi-part question, or at the very least, it was intended to be, but asked in parts, right? Like, I didn't ask the whole thing with all the segments. It was ask the question, and then here's the follow-up, so on and so forth. So the question at hand was, if you were to time travel to the future and kill your future self, would that be closer to murder or suicide? The idea being that, well, we're kind of asking about the self, right? That is still you, or at the very least, we talk about different, about you in different time periods as being all the same person, all being, in some sense, you. So you could argue maybe it would be suicide, but it feels intuitively different than that, right? It feels a little bit closer to murder because you are killing someone. Your life is not ending immediately. You're killing what appears to be what feels a lot like a different person, because this is not a person you have been, it's a person you are not yet. And so it'll eventually be you, but it is not currently, or at the very least, that's how it might feel, right? And while these intuitions, of course, are not grounded, they're not arguments, it's a really good base point. And that's something that came up in the conversation of like, it's okay to, and in fact, I think a good thing, to first get a sense of what your intuitive response to that would be. But then part of what we do, and these are the questions, is we interrogate that. We say, okay, but why is that the case? Is that justified? One of the cool things that happened in this conversation is that Hexic was way ahead of the game. Like, he was hearing this question for the first time and was uh was understanding where it could go before I mentioned the next part of it. This is to be expected. He's a smart guy. And I keep having trouble describing this in a way where it doesn't sound like I'm complaining. I like that this happened. It was really cool. It was just kind of interesting. Of like, okay, so we didn't have that much conversation with just that part of the question, because Hexic kind of noticed very quickly that you could ask this question if you go back in time and kill yourself, right? And that was the part 2 of the question. Does your answer change if you're talking about killing a past self? Well, intuitively, where we both seem to think. I guess then, before I get to what we both seem to think, there's also something to be said of like, how does this occur, right? There's some curiosity of like, well, some of the mechanics might change my answer, right? So as far as like the time travel part, I just kind of wanted to wave my hands past that, right? I'm not trying to like formulate like a mechanism by which time travel could be possible and how you avoid all the problems. We were more interested in the thought experiment, right? About the action that's being taken. So the mechanics of that is, we'll just wave our hands. We'll just say it happens. You blink into the future. You take the action, and then you immediately blink back. And if you go into the past, we're just going to wave our hands and say, don't worry, no paradoxes. And because it made sense to me at the time, why don't we say if you kill your past self, you also die immediately in the present? Because that would make sense, right? How could you be alive in the present if you were dead in the past? So it seemed to us from the outset that it would make sense to say that going back in time and killing your past self, it makes sense to call that suicide. That feels right to us. And again, we're starting from the intuitive, and then we're gonna build from there and argue with that intuition, that starting place, to see if it holds or if we should change our position. So it's okay that we're starting with a very intuitive, like, it feels like it would be suicide, and it feels like in that killing your future self would be murder. One of the things that Hexic was way ahead of the game on, to the point where I'm only realizing now as I'm talking about it, is that he asked a question at this point in the conversation that we wouldn't realize the relevance of and get back to for like another hour. Like I said, obviously from what you have seen from him, it should be clear that he's a really smart guy, but I know that too. So like, this is not strange so much as it is kind of cool to see. Because like, as much as the people around you are smart, you don't always see it in action in a way like this. So it's kind of cool. But the thing he was saying was like, it feels relevant that like, what happens to you in the present and as a result of your actions. And I'm going to leave that thought there because that's kind of what we did. We moved past that, but that will be really relevant later. And so one of the questions was like, okay, why would that be the case that we feel that there's this distinction? In a way, we're kind of saying there's something special about the self in the present. Why do I say that we can come to that conclusion? Well, because you and the any we're talking about nebulously in the future or in the past, right? And we can imagine probably like years out, right? But in practice, 10 seconds ago is you in the past, and 10 seconds from now is you in the future. Even microseconds from now, it's technically you in the future. Though that is something that came up. We seem to agree that yourself in the present is a lot more nebulous than we act like. We often think that means in the present moment, but one of the things that came up that Hexic was pointing out was like, well, when we react to stimuli, we're not reacting immediately. It takes time for the stimulus to get from its origin point to us. That might be like speed of light, or it might be smell or sound or whatever else. Then it takes time for us to process that information. And while that time is minuscule to the point of being irrelevant frequently, but not always, they're not identical time markers. To which my argument was, and I think we were in agreement, it's not super important, and so if you disagree, a great thing that I would be very interested in hearing about and why you disagree, because I don't think I don't think any part of this is like certain. I don't think we're definitely correct at any point, but this more than others I could very easily seeing being wrong about. My argument was what we mean by you in the present has always meant something more vague than the scientific precise accuracy of exactly this moment and no more micro moments before or after. We even sometimes talk about ourselves in the present or talk about other people in the present on timescales that are relevant to us as being different. You might say, hey, you literally just now said whatever the thing is in question, but they didn't literally just now say that. They said it a few seconds ago. But we consider that the same present as we do the current moment. There's a little bit of wiggle room. There's kind of like upper and lower bounds of what we call the present, what we call now. This is kind of in the same way my response has been to those incredibly annoying people who will insist that you can never I'm not touching you, because you can never really touch anything, because atoms never connect. They're always repelled by electromagnetic forces. They never touch. None of the particles touch each other. They're always separated, even though it looks like they're connected. My general response to that has been, that might be technically true, that the atoms do not connect, but that has never been what we meant by touching. We have never meant that the atoms are connected. This is a thing that actually comes up a bunch in conversations of what things mean and what they ought to mean. In fact, I'm seeing parallels now to instances where we were watching debates on whether trans people are their identified gender, right? I think the Dr. Bogardus conversation, this came up a bit of, we might say water and come to a scientific understanding that the substance that is at the heart of what we're talking about is H2O, but that doesn't mean that is always what we've meant by water. A great example of this came from actually Vosh after the debate. He was saying, like, and I think this is a phenomenal example. If I handed you a cup of water and I said, hey, this is water, you might say, okay, sure. But then I go on to say, but it's not all H2O. Some percentage of it is like minerals and stuff. That's kind of stuff we normally expect to be in water. I even said I'm drinking my water earlier, but there's other stuff in here. It's the normal minerals and other stuff that we expect to be in there, like fluoride now, because that's in the water to like help with dental health in the population. There's a lot of stuff in there that's not literal H2O. But no one would dream of calling me a liar for saying it. That would be nonsense. You would be the one who's like the person who was calling me a liar would be the one being odd, not me who said it was water, even though there's stuff that's not H2O in there. But in a different context, if I said, "Hey, what like let's say like 1% of this of water is other stuff, particulates and other non-H2O things, right?" I don't know if that's the actual number. We'll say 1%. But now let's say I hand you a glass of water and I say this is water, but that 1% that's other stuff, it's not it's not minerals and stuff. It's cyanide. I think everyone would be right to say that I lied about what I handed them. I think it would be correct to say that what I was doing was dishonest by saying it was water. Why? The same amount of it is not H2O, and we've already agreed that things that are not H2O can be called water in this context. The difference is that it is utility. It is relevantly different to you in a literal life and death sense if there's cyanide in it as opposed to like minerals and stuff. But the context matters too. In a scientific experiment, oftentimes they'll need distilled water that is nothing but H2O. And if I handed them the glass of water that is just like tap water, that would be a huge problem. And a lot of it has to do with context, right? Well, so this is why something like this is relevant. It's not literally touching, even though we can say like we've scientifically determined that like they never come into contact, but no one has ever meant that. And just the same to dial it is like to go backwards through the train of thought that I just went off on. When it comes to the self, that difference between input and response, and the difference between time code, like we'll say like timestamps between the stimulus and the process and the reaction, are frequently so close together that we would call them all the same present self. So that was a bit of a digression, but it's interesting, right? It's interesting to like, okay, we encountered an idea and we wrestled with it, right? We had argument, we had reasons to accept or reject it. In this case, reject it. But then we're left with the question again. What do we mean by the self? What is me and what isn't me? One concept that I brought up was the concept of a four-dimensional view of reality as opposed to the three-dimensional one you're used to. Obviously, objects that we're accustomed to have three dimensions, right? Height, depth, width. But we all are aware that there is an additional dimension of time. In fact, it's not separate dimensions, right? That's one of the things in relativity, is that space-time is one field, background field. They're linked and connected. They're not, you can't separate out one from the other, space or time. And so while we are limited to being able to see the world in the way that we do, we can understand at least that there are other ways of viewing that, right? If it were possible to step back and view the universe in a four-dimensional way, you would, instead of seeing an object in one point in time and another point in time, you would see it stretched in the dimension of time. And during that dimension, it would change shape as it moves or gets altered and so on and so forth. But it would be one continuous thing, right? Now, there's some nebulousness there of like, what do we mean by a thing? Why should it be the case that we consider this pen one object and not millions of atoms as objects or billions of subatomic particles as separate objects? The fact that we consider this one thing is kind of an arbitrary distinction of human outlook. It's because it's useful to us, but not because there's any objectivity to the separateness of this object, right? But we're going to skip that for the moment. So we can say, okay, if we had a four-dimensional view of ourselves, we would see I'm stretching it out in this way because that's the easiest way to imagine it. And it came up a lot in the conversation as like the time snake. Because you can kind of imagine as like stretching kind of serpentine is how it would look, but it wouldn't look that way because we're trying to imagine a four-dimensional view in three-dimensional terms. So just try to like understand what I'm talking about as opposed to like the visualization, even though this is confusing. But you would see it as the same. It would be one object, and any moment is merely a slice, right? The present moment that we see is merely a slice of what everything looks like, and we progressively see subsequent slices as long as we are moving forward in time. Uh, in which point it becomes clear that these are the same object at any given point. And this is where my concern of like, well, what makes the present special? Shouldn't it be indistinct? Why is that particular slice of time for this object different than any that preceded and any that followed? It doesn't make sense that there should be such a distinction, but it seems to make sense that there would be one. So what do we do about this? There were I don't know if we even came to a conclusion as to what to do with that problem. Um, One of the other things that came up as an idea was the well, I guess. Oh, I think the solution to that problem. Well, maybe not a solution, but one thing we said about it. I'm trying to remember because it was several days ago. It was a 2-hour conversation, and obviously a lot of it was like, you forget some of the stuff that you talk about, and you remember other things. I'm only relaying to you, obviously, the things that I remember and seemed interesting to me. One idea that we got to much later was that actually, I'll save that. I'll present other ideas of the self before we get to conclusions we got to. Another idea of the self that we considered was what's the game? I asked him and he told me, and then I asked friends and they told me, and I keep forgetting. There's a game, I think it's like Katagatari or something like that. I'm gonna look this up because it's gonna drive me insane. There's a game where you start as a small little object. Katamara Damacy. Okay, sorry. I was trying to explain it as I looked, but I couldn't do that. So there's a game. Why don't I like shift view so I can show you all what I'm talking about? But there's a game where the way it works is you start as a small little object. I think I never actually played it, so I don't remember. I don't actually know what you start as, or um, but I know the basic gist of how the game works. So you start as like a small thing and you roll along and you collect more stuff and you get bigger and bigger as you aggregate more things. Now, apparently this is a very popular game and it was intended as a critique of capitalism, but was not read as such. But like, yeah, you roll along and you pick up stuff and you get bigger and bigger and you keep rolling and so on and so forth. Okay, fine. Why do I bring that up? Well, the idea is, well, what if the self is a little like that? We can say maybe that you are the accumulation of not just of matter in part, right? Because the bounds of you, to some extent, end at the end where your flesh ends or where your body ends, wherever we like. That's kind of a nebulous thing, right? Like, is your hair part of that, whatever? But the point is, like, 2 feet that way is not me, right? There's some amount of that, like the physical aspect of that. So, like, you are part of that, but also the accumulation of your thoughts, experiences, emotions, so on and so forth. That as time progresses, at least in our perspective, we aggregate and gain more experiences and add on to, and like those affect how we see ourselves and so on. And we kind of like build on top with more experiences. So you can look back on the past and just like in Katamari, where you can say everything that is in that is in me. And there's nothing that has that I don't. So while it might not be all of me, there is no part of it that is not me. And so we might in that sense be able to say, well, therefore, killing the past self is killing something that is 100% me, and so therefore it makes sense to be called suicide. But killing the future self, well, that self has stuff that I don't have yet. While everything that is comprised of me exists in that, not everything in that future self exists in me. There is some amount of it that is not me right now. That seemed really interesting, and it seemed like a cool way of viewing the self. But we were both immediately struck with the obvious problem, which is that we do not merely aggregate. We also lose parts of ourselves. This is most obvious in the physical body. If you get a haircut and then grow more hair and then get a haircut and grow more hair, that's new stuff. And you lost old stuff. Your cells replace themselves. Not all of them, I don't think, but most of them do, and on different time levels. I think I think spinal cells take the longest to replace. I think it's something like 7 years or something like that. But even still, most of your cells replace themselves. And even on a personality, even in the access of personality, sometimes you gain or lose certain traits. Now you might be able to frame that instead as you have changed due to the accumulation of experiences and thoughts and so on. But you can also put it as like, well, you've lost something of yourself. That might not necessarily be a bad thing, by the way. The initial thought is, teenagers are often kind of toxic and whatever, and they're figuring out who they are, but then they grow up and they're normally like, and I don't mean to like paint all teenagers like this, but they're like, people also lose toxic elements of themselves. We grow and improve often, and you leave behind some stuff. For example, an expectation of adults is that you have lost your immaturity. You have ceased to be immature. That is something you do not have anymore. And so this accumulation model doesn't really work, does it? It was interesting, and I'm relaying it because there's a lot of interesting stuff that we might have that might not work. It's important to acknowledge that in these processes, we will get things wrong. We will likely get all of it wrong. But it's really cool to see, like, you can interrogate your ideas. Cool, we thought of an interesting concept, but we can also tear it apart. And that's part of, and I keep pointing this out because that's kind of what I want to do here, right? That's kind of what these are the questions for me is about. Is learning how to think philosophically, as I keep saying, but also part of what that means is coming up with ideas and rejecting them, and for reasons, having reasons why these things work or don't work. But we're left with a problem again. What is it about the self in the present that makes it unique? We couldn't think of a reason why it should be unique. So why are we treating it as such? There are two solutions to this problem that we found. There are probably others and better ones, but these are the ones that we came to. Sorry, very thirsty. As I say, it's a hot day. The first one goes back to the question that Hexic had asked earlier on, and while we didn't realize that he had we didn't realize, oh hey, you actually kind of asked this question earlier. I'm realizing now, like, he was ahead of the game on this, which was the statement about, well, it feels relevant what happens to yourself in the present. Because one of the things we asked was, okay, well, what if you don't die in the present when you kill your past self? Does that change what we think of these events? And it seemed to. It made sense in a way to say, well, you're killing, but you didn't die, so you must not have killed yourself. By the way, we didn't spend a lot of time on definitions of this stuff. I think we could have, and that would have been interesting. We just didn't. And it comes up a couple of times, like here, Where, well, what do we mean by suicide? What do we mean by murder? And by the way, with murder, I'm trying, I want the spicy language, I want it to seem like cool or whatever. But in a philosophical sense, I don't want the moral weight of that is not what's relevant, right? Is it closer to killing someone else? Was how we would ask that. But normally we would call that murder, even though not all instances of killing someone else is murder. Well, we're talking about it in the sense of like intentionally doing it, and okay, but it's not for the moral weight, right? We're asking about, is it closer to suicide, which we would call killing yourself, ending your own life, or is it closer to murder, which we would call ending a different person's life? Put in those terms, by the way, it's something we didn't do. Maybe we could wrap this up immediately and just say, well, if we agree that your past self and your future self are still yourself, you are killing yourself. And that makes a lot of sense. But if we say taking your own life, well, then it really matters whether you die or not, right? And when you kill your future self, there's just no reason to expect that you would, right? We all will die in the future. That doesn't mean we're dead now. There's no. It doesn't make any sense for causality to work that way, intuitively at least. I know, like with particle physics, things get crazy. But, if you could hypothetically, we're waving our hands at the paradoxes. We're just saying, don't worry about it. It's not a thing. If you could go back in time and kill your past self, and you in the present didn't die, it does a little bit seem like that wouldn't be suicide as much. That's how it seemed to us. That it would be closer to murder in that case. So it seems a little bit like what we mean by suicide is kind of like ending your life in the present, which is currently the only way that that's possible. But it does seem to have some sort of logical sense. Another thing that we came to is like a potential solution to this, and I'm pretty sure I'm relaying to you poorly what we decided on, because when we came to the conclusion about why it made sense to us, we were both very happy. We're like, that actually makes a lot of sense. I don't really have any issues with that. And as I'm thinking of it now, it doesn't seem right to me. So my guess is I'm probably not relaying it as well as we actually said last Thursday. And so if you, again, another point which, a lot of conversation can be had if you want to in the comments or in the Discord or whatever. Another potential solution was one that I just like analogies. It's just going to happen a lot. So I analogized as kind of like a number line in like middle school math class, or I don't even know if it's maybe elementary school. I don't remember when number lines were a thing. But there is something unique about this specific point, because there are two arrows that go in opposite directions from the present. Those arrows are everything in the past we have no ability to change. And everything in the future, everything in the present onward, everything in the future, is something that we do not have information about. We can get some implications of it. We can get some information, right? Obviously there are predictions that we can make about what will happen in the future to varying levels of accuracy. And the more certain it is, the more you can say you knew that, right? But we don't really know, right? Like, at the very least, there is definitely information in the future that we cannot have at present. And so the present exists at this intersection where it is the only moment in which we have access to affecting our behavior, which we do in the present and onward. We can only affect what we will do, not what we have done. But it's also a moment where we can have knowledge about the situation. Because while I can change what I do in the future, I will when I get there. We all will. I don't have currently any information, or I currently lack information about that future on which I could make a decision. So maybe the special thing about the present is that it is at the only moment where you can both have information and act in such a way to change it. There's a part of me that's not super happy with that, but it seemed to make sense at the time, at the very least. Or it seemed at the very least helpful. Like it seemed to contribute to an understanding that we could get to. And of course there's a difficulty that came up of like, well, if we do consider it as closer to a different, like the past self is kind of like a different person, and that's why we will call it murder and not suicide. We do encounter an issue of culpability. The example I used is from The Office, if any of you are fans. In fact, from the Superfan episodes, from some deleted scenes. There's an episode where Ryan, one of the characters who, well, let's just say, does a lot of shitty stuff, is confronted by Kevin, who says, hey, like a few months ago, didn't you like wreck the mirror of my car? And he was like, and Ryan goes, listen, that was old Ryan. I'm a different guy now. We can't let that guy keep hurting us, you know? We can't let him keep affecting us into the past, you know? And Kevin's like, well, but that guy is you, right? And he's like, it's who I used to be. It's not who I am anymore. Kevin's like, yeah, but like I had to spend a few $100s on this. Like, and this seems like it's on you. To which Ryan insists on like, listen, we can't let that guy hurt us anymore. We both got to move on and not let him hurt us in the future or whatever. Now, obviously, that seems like nonsense, and it comes to a head when Kevin then wrecks the mirror on Ryan's car and goes, oh man, that was Kevin 1.0. We can't let that guy hurt us anymore. We got to move on, saying all the same things. And of course, the problem becomes obvious even to Ryan of like, yeah, like obviously he's stuck. He can't say, no, you did this and I can hold you to account without agreeing to the same for himself. But the point is that as much as we might at some sense feel like our past selves is somewhat different than us, at the very least where it feels we seem to say we were okay with saying killing your past self would be murder as opposed to suicide. There is an issue of like, well, but that past self you are still responsible for, right? You still did the things you did. We would never accept if someone like did an actual murder, not like hypothetical thought experiment murder, but like actually killed another human. We would never accept, oh, that was past me. You can't hold me to account for that. Ever. But a lot of the reason for that is like, well, I shouldn't say a lot of the reason for that. And so that's part of what the timeline, like the number line explanation helped with a little bit, to say, well, that's still you, but there is something special about the present you as distinct from past and future because you are unable to affect the past, even though it still might make sense to hold you to account for that. Now, there are problems with this that are becoming obvious to me now. I don't think we dealt with them at the time. Maybe they didn't come up, or maybe, remember, hazy memory. It's possible that I'm forgetting key parts of the conversation that either resolved this or made this a non-issue or maybe like supplemented what I'm discussing here. I'm just trying to, as I say, catch you up on what was missed because it was a really good conversation. I don't want it to just be lost forever. So here's an approximation. I feel like there's something missing here, but obviously I don't remember what. If I did, I would say it. And so we felt pretty comfortable. At this point, we're about an hour into the conversation. And we felt pretty comfortable with where we landed. It seems to make sense to say that if you went into the future and killed yourself, that would in fact be murder. And if you went into the past and killed yourself, it would also be murder. But if you died in the present, it would also be suicide. And I think that's reasonable. One of the ways that we consider this is, you can imagine a suicide bomber. You know, it's not good to do that. Don't do it, obviously. But if someone were to strap a bomb to themselves, stand next to somebody, and detonate it, that one action would both be murder and suicide. That makes sense. And in the same way, we were conceptualizing the instance of killing the past self. I'm realizing now that I feel very unsatisfied with the reasoning that I've laid out for this. Again, I can't be sure that is because what the conclusion we came to was unsatisfying, or it's because I'm missing something that was integral to why this made a lot of sense to us, and we were comfortable with it. We felt that we had argued the relevant details of this. I'm also skipping some stuff. Some of it was just, it didn't end up going anywhere. It was like a thought for the moment, right? As I say, we're already like, my recount is already about an hour into the conversation, and I haven't been talking for an hour. And I've been over-explaining stuff and going into tangents that we didn't go on then. There's a lot of stuff missing. One of those things that I do remember as coming up was another conception of the self that I want to include here, mostly because I struggled so much to engage with it. Hexic had suggested how do I put this? It's what he was describing as a Jungian idea of the self, and I phrase it that way because while I am happy to accept Hexic's description of it, even he was saying, like, it's my memory of it, maybe I'm getting it wrong. But we'll call it the like Jungian version of the self, even if it doesn't cleanly map onto what Jung said. Remember, the important thing is not who said it, but what the idea is. So even if this is completely different than what Jung said about as an idea of the self, it doesn't matter. We have the idea. We can wrestle with that. So that's what we'll talk about here. The idea, as laid out, was basically that there is a version of you that exists kind of in like a hypothetical, idealized, conceptual space. It felt, as described, very Platonic, if you're familiar with the Platonic forms, as like there is a literal realm of the forms wherein things are idealized, and not idealized in the sense of like it's perfect and heavenly, but so much as this is the epitome of the form of that thing. It felt very much reminiscent of that kind of way of looking at things, and there is that for the self. There is an idealized version of you to which you are trying to live up, and that like guilt is the feeling of harm to this hypothetical self, and so there is a wrongness that comes with harming that future self. And so can't we apply that to the conversation in hand? Can't we say, okay, with this idea of the self, can't we say there is a version of which killing your future self is I think it was killing a future self is murder or suicide. I don't remember exactly how it was employed. So sorry, like I disagreed with the suggestion so much that I even now can't remember what the follow-up argument was. I couldn't even really engage with the follow-up because the proposal of the idea of the self was so fundamentally unworkable to me, and I'll explain why. This, by the way, I take to be a failing on my part. I don't think I said as much in that conversation, but I want to be clear that I could not argue the ramifications of this view because I could not even for a moment, even for the sake of argument, act as though it were true, I think is a way I could get better at philosophy. I'll explain why, but it was so obviously unworkable to me, and so thoroughly so that I couldn't engage with any follow-ups. So here are my problems. The first is in what way this idealized form exists. If it exists in a Platonic sense, in that there is a literal, a literal ideal plane and it exists there, and that is what we can live up to, how could we possibly know anything about it? We can't observe this like perfect plane directly. We'd have no way of knowing any characteristics or attributes. As far as we know, anything we think is good would be as in opposition to the idealized self. You might think that like learning a new skill is a good thing, but the idealized self actually is without any knowledge. How could you know? Now there's an implication of like, well, it's idealized, so it's all the good stuff, but what do we consider good stuff, right? It assumes a lot of things built in there that we can't know, and we have no reason to believe. Like, it's basically making an appeal to to this idealized version of yourself, so that you can know what is good or bad to do, but you only can know what that idealized self is by appealing to your instinctive intuition about what's good or bad to do. It's circular. The alternative version of that is that this is not an objective, existing, idealized state. Rather, it is our conception of our idealized self. That makes a lot more sense to me. We all have ideas of what we ought to be, but those ideas, by nature, are going to be extremely subjective. And while that's not necessarily a problem in and of itself, obviously, like, subjectivity is a thing and something we have to wrestle with, it doesn't make it illegitimate. The problem is appealing to it is to merely appeal to the ideals of the person that you're talking to. We can imagine a person who, actually, a very good idea, a very good example, as a historical one. Well, this is the internet. Let's talk about Hitler. For Hitler, say in 1935, like, an idealized version of him would probably be closer to what he was doing in the 1940s. But obviously that isn't ideal in any sense, right? That's actually the opposite of ideal. His idealized self was a self that does a lot of really evil, terrible things, and wants to make the world much, much, much worse. I have no interest in appealing to that idealized self. I think it would be very good if he didn't do that. If he hadn't done that at all, like, so in that way we can see the problem of the subjective version of that. Of, well, you're only really saying that we should appeal to a person's values, but we've seen that people can have really shitty values. So I just found this view one that I couldn't work with, and yeah, I will say I think it's kind of sad that I couldn't. Something that I think I could be better at. I can often entertain ideas as like, okay, let's say it's like this, what would that mean? But I couldn't here because it just doesn't work, and the implications are just so difficult to wrestle with. Now, of course, maybe I'm misunderstanding what was being expressed. Maybe there's something that like solves these problems for me, but we didn't encounter them. So we mostly had to move on. And I am sorry, Hexic, in case you're watching. You had proposed an interesting idea for the self, and I simply could not engage. I'm not perfect, and yeah, I don't know. It's a minor sad thing that I just couldn't engage with it very much. I mostly just had to say I can't. It doesn't work for me in any way, and I can't derive implications because of the problems that I encounter on the way to get there. So okay, we seemed pretty comfortable saying the self in the past, present, and future are the same person, but your relation to them and your actions regarding them might be described differently than your relation to yourself in the present. And that would mean going back in time and killing your past self would be murder. It would be suicide if you also died in the present, but only if that were the case. And going in the future and killing yourself could only be murder. So we were comfortable with that. But then I raised what I think was a really, really interesting, like obviously I think it's interesting, but like I think this was pretty important and a really interesting follow-up to this, which was, well, we can do something like going to the future and killing your future self. We can't literally time travel. Well, we can literally time travel in the sense that we're all doing it. We're all moving forward through time. We can't accelerate that process. I can't go encounter myself as I exist 20 years from now and then come back. But I can make choices that affect that self 20 years from now. The initial example is, what if I took up smoking? I'm not a smoker. I'm very opposed to smoking. In part because it is very hazardous to one's health. Lethally so. People die from smoking all the time. Now, this example ended up being a little bit worse than the one we mostly used. The reason being is there's a bit of uncertainty. You could smoke for 20 years and not die of it because maybe you got shot or hit by a bus or like fell off a thing or whatever. You know, there's not a certainty there. And so you can have a little bit of like, well, it might not kill me in the future. And so what we went with is the more extreme version of that, and then never really got back to. I guess we kind of did. Well, I'll talk about the more extreme version of it, and we'll circle back. The more extreme version of this, but one that illustrates the concern more clearly, is if anyone's familiar with the movie Saw. Let's say you strap a contraption that's like would feel appropriate in one of those movies to yourself. This contraption would be like a collar about the neck that in 20 years will extend blades and decapitate you. That is, without question, that will kill you. And the question is, well, is that murder or suicide? It seems to be suicide, just long form. But the concern I had was, well, hold on. What in actuality, what actually is the difference between that action and the time travel example? In both instances, you are taking an action in the present that causes yourself in the future to die, and not you in the present. What's different about it? It does seem different. I'm comfortable saying it's different. And it's not like there's a difference of like expectation. You know in both cases what's going to happen. It's not like there's any uncertainty. The only way it could be different maybe is that like I'll back it up. I'm skipping multiple thoughts as I get here. Because we can imagine a person who does this in a shorter term sense. You know, they set up a Rube Goldberg machine so that when they get into the bath, 10 minutes from then, the machine will finish all of its machinations and dump a toaster that's plugged into the wall in the bath with you. Now, maybe that doesn't kill you, by the way. What if you get out of the tub in 9 minutes? That won't kill you. You won't be there. But in the event that you are still there, you could be pretty it would make sense to say that that person knew that this was going to happen, knew it was going to kill them, and effectively killed themselves, committed suicide, just in a long term, in an extended form. Well, why is that different for the 20 years thing? Well, it shouldn't be, except it is in action the same as the time travel example. Why does it seem different? Perhaps it's not different. Maybe you're sitting there and this entire time you've been screaming at your screen, no, it's all suicide. That's all the self. You're always killing the self. It is always suicide. I think I'm mostly comfortable with that, even though that's not what we got to on Thursday. But if you entertain the idea that's not the breakdown, right? If I'm asking you to do the exact thing I struggle to do with the idea of the Jungian idealized self, then you have to wonder, like, what is the difference? One thing that seems pretty intuitive to most people, and that I agree with a lot actually, is the existence of bodies. There's a phrase I had heard. I shouldn't say a phrase. There was a sentiment expressed previously that I had heard. I forget who the lecturer was. I want to say it was Lawrence Krauss, but I could be mistaken. It might have been someone else. Might have been Daniel Dennett. I don't know. There are a few people it could be. They express the idea that it's not that we have bodies, but that we are bodies. As much as we think of ourselves very often as like, I have hands and I have a face, it is more accurate to say that I am my body, and the brain is a part of that. The mind is an aspect of the brain, which is a part of the body. And with that view, when there are multiple bodies, there are multiple people. At a minimum, that is how people conceptualize it. But that conceptualization doesn't make it that this is how we view the world, doesn't make it how things are, right? It's just, at a minimum, that's how we seem to experience the world. And most of the time this isn't an issue, because the only time you will see multiple bodies is when there are multiple people. This is why when you see twins, you don't go, hold on, is that the same person? And like they're different, like they time traveled or they cloned them. You understand it's two different people that look the same, because there are two different bodies. Now, of course, this comes to be kind of an issue when we're talking about time travel, because you have two bodies, but that are the same person, right? That's the whole issue with these time travel questions. That's the whole thing that comes up. And it might not be a soluble problem. But the idea is like, okay, well, the existence of multiple bodies in the time travel thing makes it more like murder. You are doing to another body, not to your own body. This also solves the problem of going back in time and killing your past self. And the reason why the culpability of your past self applies to your present self is very simple. It's the same body at a different point in time. Now, obviously, throughout all this, it's something I forgot to mention. This came up earlier, but it applies here as well, is the issue of the ship of Theseus, right? For those of you who are unfamiliar, the ship of Theseus is literally millennia old, and it is a thought experiment where it goes like this: if you had the ship of Theseus, it was yours, it was in your possession, whatever, and you were to change out one board. By the way, this is from like ancient Greece, so it's all wood. It's not like metal and stuff like that, but it works. You just have to change the terminology with anything that is comprised of objects. And you change out one board, and the next day you change another one, and then next day you change a different one, and you do this every day until you have replaced every board. Would that still be the ship of Theseus? If it is, what is it about the object that maintains its like selfness when all of the parts have changed? Because at this point, the boat you have has no pieces, is comprised exactly 0% by the same materials that comprised it from the beginning. So what is the like essence of sameness that gets transposed through, that maintains through this process? And if it's a different boat, at what point did it become different? When half of the boards were different? When you changed out the first one? The last one? At what point? Like, certainly it was at some point the ship of Theseus, and it is now not. Where in that process did that change? it seems reasonable at a minimum that when you changed out one board, it was still the same boat. Boats change, like you can change out, that happens all the time. You swap out one thing, you haven't created a new object. Some people, by the way, have argued that you have, but at the very least, in an intuitive sense, it seems like you haven't. But that's not really I don't want to present that like an answer. It's just like the thought I had about it in this moment. There isn't an answer to this problem, obviously. It's a problem that has existed for literal millennia. The point is that we have this issue coming up of, and this is, oh, I forgot the last thing I was talking about where it makes this relevant. Oh, the body's problem and like the self, right? You gain and lose parts of yourself. Your skin or your cells die and regrow and all this stuff. A lot of these things come up over and over and over of like, at what point, like, are you the ship, have you been ship of Theseus? This is solved a little bit by the four-dimensional view of the object, but only if you assume the sameness of the object. This is where the issues of constituency came up, right? We call this one pen. I know this doesn't look like a pen, but if there's a pen in there. But it's got all these little pieces on it. If I swap them out, if I swap all of them out, I swapped out the ink cartridge recently. We still call it the same pen, even though, and in this case, it's more poignant because the ink cartridge is the pen part of the pen. That's the part of the pen that we consider most important for it being a pen, is its ability to write. This isn't a soluble problem, but it's one that comes up, right? And it's something to wrestle with, and you see how it's cropping up here. And with the example I mentioned of like the 20-year murder machine, the thing that will decapitate the wearer 20 years after they attach it, I was starting to notice that it really mattered to me what the answer to that question was, because I was seeing political ramifications. So Hexic was like, okay, well, let's explore that. Like, let's put this aside. Like, why does it matter, right? And the reason it matters is because if we're comfortable saying that going into the future and killing your future self is murder, and that something like this, long-form suicide, is murder, well, what do we do with murderers? Right? There are criminal consequences for murder. If you were to do this, could you be imprisoned? And this becomes more extreme when you talk about other things that are extremely risky or certain to cause you long-term issues. Smoking, for example. I don't think you should be charged with in accordance with murder because you picked up smoking, even though it definitely does shorten your lifespan. In a way, it has ended your life earlier than it would have ended otherwise. And then it gets even worse, right? Is overeating or undereating now an act of murder, especially if you do it intentionally? Is the supersize option at a fast food restaurant being like complicit in tons of homicide? And this was really important to me. Like, I felt compelled to find a reason why that answer should be no. It should be suicide because of all these problems. And then I realized, and then I had what I think was the most important realization, at least for me, of the entire conversation, which was that I accidentally brought an assumption in with me, which was that the appropriate response to whether these things are murder is to punish them criminally. You see how I just like kind of skipped past that when I was talking about it? It just seemed reasonable. Like, yeah, I guess that is what we do. But why? It makes a lot of sense for murder as we consider it. With someone who commits a murder, one, you want them quarantined from society so that they can't do that more. That doesn't apply here. You can't kill yourself more than once. You also want, well, there are different versions of justice, of criminal justice. I subscribe to a very left-leaning version of that, where the point is rehabilitation. I want to prevent murders by minimizing people's interest in doing them. Uh, Same with a lot of other crimes. This is why people on the left generally tend to say that the solution to drug addiction shouldn't be a criminal one, because that does nothing to impact whether people are addicted to drugs. What does do something about that is creating a world where people are less interested in doing that. What also helps with that are efforts at rehabilitation. It's a medical issue, not a criminal one, or it should be treated as such. I don't want someone to it's not helpful for society, I guess I'll put it that way, to throw someone in a prison cell because they're addicted to heroin, but it is really helpful for society if that person doesn't have a reason to become addicted in the first place. That's what I mean by that is that some amount of the time people use drugs because their lives are in bad shape. This is like I've heard about it, like experiments with the same thing where like rats given, I think it was like rats had access to like LSD and food, or maybe it wasn't LSD, but like some drug or other. And if they left the rat just in an empty room with nothing to do and like no other rats or whatever else, they would do the drugs to the point of not eating and dying. But if they were in an enclosure where they had like exercise wheels and stuff to do and basically like rat heaven, they didn't even touch the drugs. They just didn't have a reason. Like, why? My life's great. I don't need this supplement to feel like my life is better. There's an implication, of course, that like humans might behave in the same way. So this is what I mean. Like, if fewer people even have a desire to do drugs, that's pretty good for society. And if when someone is addicted, it's treated by helping them stay safe, helping them get clean, giving them resources, that's also good for society. Throwing them in a jail cell isn't. So why was my response to say, well, if long form suicide is equivalent to murder, that therefore must be punishable, be something that is responded to with criminal punishment? That's kind of weird, right? It was just an assumption I didn't realize I was carrying with me. Instead, maybe the thought is the same as with drug addiction. Should endeavor to create a society where people are less interested in strapping on the murder machine intentionally, where people are advised against taking actions that will harm them long term. So I don't mean like so for example, when it comes to like proper nutrition and stuff, having access to the ability to do that, and also being educated in a way where they know like part of the problem is like if you don't know what you're doing is bad for you, that how like you might just do it not knowing. So knowing that this stuff is like education is important on that. Why is that? That should be the political ramification, irrespective of whether it's murder or not. And suddenly that question seems to evaporate in relevance. And this is something that was really awesome to me because I learned something about myself that, like everyone else, there are things I was taught that I need to unlearn. There are assumptions that I might accidentally bring into a conversation with me, even if I don't even really agree with them. I've never I don't want to say never, but like I don't talk about criminal justice as like punitive and punishing and like this is how you ought to respond, and yet I effortlessly, like without thinking, just did that for this example. And so it was kind of cool to have that unexpected benefit of doing these are the question segments of, well, I learned something about myself that's pretty important, and I realized that, yeah, why should it mean that? If someone straps the murder machine to their neck, or I guess the suicide machine to their neck, what does throwing them in a prison cell do? It doesn't do anything. Who's it helping? Instead, should probably like, all right, let's get the murder machine off of them. Yeah, like maybe that should be the response, and maybe therapy and rehabilitation of like, well, if someone wanted to do that, maybe they need help, and maybe that should be our response. And suddenly it doesn't really matter whether that's murder or not. It's bad enough that it's bad for a person, and the people matter, and they deserve to have good lives that are happy. And if they aren't having good lives, punishing them for it seems like a weird response, actually. Instead, we should endeavor to make our society one in which people are able to be happy, and people have the ability to do that and to make their lives better, and to value themselves, because people matter. And this is kind of what I ended with. I can't, unfortunately, muster the same emotional affect and import that I had on Thursday. But it's just a reminder to you as we get to the end of this and leaving it kind of intentionally up in the air, that I guess I'll back up because I'm ahead of myself. The solution that I ended up finding, because I had a problem, right? I was worried that my principles, if we called the suicide machine murder, that my principles would be basically like I would have to act in opposition to my principles because of the conclusion that we reached. That, oh, it seems I was wrong about this, and that would mean that we'd have to be a lot more punitive about stuff. But then was actually saved from that conclusion by adhering to my principles, to those values I have in human happiness and well-being. Because the person who straps on the suicide machine matters, and you matter. And it's good for you to live a happy, fulfilled life, just as it's good for the next person. And this is how we get to stuff where we can see, and this is how this is really easy in principle, but in practice it ends up being difficult, of seeing our enemies, quote unquote, suffer and realizing that that's bad too. And I'm brought to think of this in these terms in part because of what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now. It's something I kind of left. I haven't spoken about since my initial mention of it last week, but there have been developments. I'm not going to go super into it because I don't think I'm very good at news coverage. I try to do it when I can and when it's important, but I don't think that I am the best at it, so I'm not going to pretend like this is thorough. But it seems that, like I was worried about, there's a lot of like genocidal, well, maybe not genocidal yet, but like action and preparation going on in Gaza as retaliation for the Hamas attack. As of I think it was like as of this weekend, the IDF ordered 1.1 million Palestinians from the northern half of Gaza to the southern, having to cross over a river, and they were told they had 24 hours to do it. Now I don't think it's actually worked out that way, but like, that's kind of, they were told, like, that's a huge mass exodus, that evacuation. 24 hours for 1.1 million people who don't have water or power before the Israeli military marches in and starts doing whatever, including mowing people down probably. They've already killed some reporters, and they do this a lot, actually. And I look at this and I say, shouldn't they be able to see that this is, like, what they're doing is wrong? The Palestinians in Gaza did not do the Hamas attack. Most of them are children. The average age in Gaza is very young. As I understand, like it's something like at least 70% of the population is below 30. Like, that's crazy, crazy young. A lot of these people are literal children, and it does make it seem like the values are different. That the values of people like like Netanyahu. Well, I mean, I already knew this, but like, it's not for the human happiness and well-being. If it was, should be easy to see that making people you don't like suffer is still suffering. It's something I'll talk about later, but this is actually something that comes up explicitly in Jewish tradition. Is the wrongness, that it is not good for your enemies to suffer either. So that sucks. I think we're gonna call it here because, as I say, I have a lot of stuff to do. This was, I hope, something that you would find interesting. Uh, and I got all depressed because of what's going on in the Middle East. But yeah, like that aside, which we didn't really talk about in the actual conversation, it was a really cool conversation. I'm really sad that the actual audio is not available for that. I've been checking ever since, like every day. I double check to make sure that the same issue hasn't occurred. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. We'll be doing more of those segments in the future. Again, I don't really want to do it like every week. Maybe like every other week, something like that. Uh, and if you find it interesting, if you also found it interesting, and I hope you did, please, I would encourage you to talk about it in the comments. Tell me what you think. There's undoubtedly lots of stuff we missed, lots of stuff we left out, and I'm curious what everyone thinks about it. I mean, even this over this weekend when I was talking about these questions with some friends, very quickly, almost immediately, they were proposing ideas that we hadn't considered. And yeah, that's why it's cool to do this with another person. This is why I don't want to do these are the questions just on my own. I could just sit here and talk to the chat and the camera and go on about my musings on these questions. But one, it wouldn't be nearly as long because the interplay of thoughts takes longer to go over than just one person expressing them. But also, like, I'm gonna live way more out on the table than if I'm in a conversation, and particularly with Hexic, who has a lot of really cool, interesting ideas. And in the future, if we bring other people on, we're going to get a lot of unique insight, and that's really cool. In fact, one of the things that came up that I forgot to mention was that Hexic was mentioning is like, I'm an animator, so a lot of what I'm thinking about visually, which is different than how I think about things. And it's really cool to have those different kinds of inputs, of a different way of seeing the world, and talking with someone who looks at things differently. So, I hope you found that interesting. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.